Hey, deserving listeners, today's episode is about sleep training for infants, trying to train them to sleep throughout the night, trying to train them to sleep on their own without you needing to be right by their side or at the ready, constantly helping them to adjust and be resilient within reason based on the kid and based on the age, making it age appropriate. And I am prompted to make this episode because there was an email about this, and I decided to formalize I have a whole approach to this that I've worked with parents before as a therapist, but I've never developed notes on a lecture that I can provide general audiences. So I spent time on that, and I thought I would get into it today. So let's get to it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's read the email. Anonymous patron, she says, I am a first-time mama of a third-generation bad sleeper. I would love it if you could do a deep dive on sleep training. So just chiming in, sounds like herself is a bad sleeper or was a bad sleeper as an infant, and at least one of her parents also. So anonymous patron is saying, I would love it if you could do a deep dive on sleep training. I'm not going to do a deep dive today, but I am going to do a mini deep dive. I thought about it, took some notes, looked up research, that kind of thing. Going on with the email, there is very conflicting evidence out there. Some suggest it is not psychologically damaging to do sleep training. Others suggest that it is psychologically damaging to engage in sleep training. Some say it works, others say it doesn't. Information within healthcare is also conflicting. I would love to know more about this billion-dollar industry from a psychological perspective. End of email. Yeah, well, part of the problem is that it's a billion-dollar industry. And anytime it's a billion-dollar industry, anytime there's money, there's going to be charlatans and people trying to put down other points of view. So that adds fuel to the fire. And okay, so sleep training. Lots to say. It is complicated as all get out. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of passionate opinions. There's a lot of misinformation. Even before the internet, there was a lot of misinformation. And of course, now there's tons. And there's a lot of judgment that's being waged against people, a lot of rage that's happening. And some of it, might be justified. Most of it, in my observation, is not. And what I'll say as a caveat to all this is that if you've, for you, anonymous patron, you've already absorbed a lot of the discourse, the conflicting discourse and the claims. This is anecdotal, most of what is said in culture and on the internet, in my neck of the woods anyway, most of what's said about sleep training is all bullshit. Most of it is bullshit in that they might have found something that works for themselves as a parent or as an author, and they are claiming that all other ways aren't going to work. Or they're trying to sell a book, or they have a particular way of looking at the world and they just want to shoehorn that in, or they had a certain sleep training done on them, and even though it was damaging to them, they don't recognize that, and so they propose, and I'll get into it, but there's a lot of bullshit on the internet. And as background for why people should listen to me about this is that as a therapist for almost 30 years, a good portion, particularly in the beginning, the first 15 years of my career, about a third of my clients were families, and a portion of them were infants and young children, or at least as a part of the family therapy, this was talked about. And parenting of all phases, all ages of kids was something that I was tasked with learning about and helping people with, and it's complicated. And I don't have a book on this. I don't have a bone to pick about this. So I think that might help in terms of demonstrating credibility, which is hard to find. To find a guru or a therapist or an expert on parenting and on sleep training, often economics are involved, and therefore I don't know if it's easy to trust them. Now, there's a lot of researchers out there that are looking into this in a very non-biased way, but people don't tend to connect with the actual researchers, right? It's the authors that pull from the research and will anyway. So let's start this lecture by going over some of the main methods that have already been established. And you might see some themes here. I'm not going to go into full detail on all of them because it doesn't really matter, but I just thought you should know the lay of the land. And anonymous patron, you probably have come across some of these, if not all of them. So the first one I want to talk about is the cry it out method. Cry it out. So this is considered to be like an extinction behavioral method in that you're trying to extinguish the crying behavior by not rewarding it, so to speak. And I'll tell you from the get-go that this is not recommended. Now, with some kids, it could be effective and non-damaging, but it is at risk of damaging kids because the way that it is conducted is that it's very rigid and the child is left in the crib and they cry. And, if you have a young infant, that a majority of them will not adjust well to that intervention, so to speak. And they will call out to you. It'll be blood-curdling kind of screams sometimes. Sometimes it could be unrelenting, maybe even a couple hours. I've seen that before. It's not usually, but it can be. And the parents are instructed to not respond because you have to trust the process and eventually the child will stop crying. Well, the problem is, the child stops crying because they give up. They give up on crying. They also give up on you. They give up on safety. They give up on emotion. They give up on humanity. So, they'll stop crying and you'll be able to read your book and watch TV and not be bothered by it, but at what fucking cost? So there's that. Now, I have talked with clients and experts and friends of mine who did use a version of the cry it out method, but the kid was either just really easygoing and only went through minimal distress before adjusting, or the parents actually did the cry it out method in a way that incorporated some of the things I'll get into later. So might someone step forward, and I've had people step forward and say, no, I did the cry it out method and it worked, and I'm a therapist and it didn't harm and then I inquire more and I'm like, oh, okay, well, you're doing a version of it and I think your kid was probably deceased. Because that's another thing that happens with parenting is that people assume that parenting is the same for all children, that all children are the same. And you can have one kid that you barely have to do anything and they sleep throughout the night and you put them down and there's a little bit of interacting, maybe you sing a song or you just have some eye contact or you cuddle with them and then you put them in the crib. They fall asleep and they're asleep for 9 hours and you wake up in the morning, you're all refreshed. And what will happen sometimes is that the parents will think, I am a god of a parent and my method really works. And it's like, yeah, with that kid. Whereas across town or next door, there's another family with a kid and the parents are doing everything right and the kid is not adjusting for one reason or another and the parents are judging themselves and everyone is judging them. So that's a very important thing to understand is children emerge into this plane of existence with varying levels of personality traits and tendencies and sensitivities and stuff. I hope that that's understood. So anyway, that's cried out. Another method that's been formalized and described is the Ferber method. It's named after someone named Ferber. And this is similar to the cried out method, but it's more gradual extinction of the behavior of crying in that you check on the baby at increasing intervals. And this can work. So the way that it can, but again, if you follow it too rigidly, it can, and I'll get into the fundamentals later, but because my point, my overall thesis here is that when you understand the fundamentals, regardless of, and adhere to them and incorporate them, regardless of what method you use, it will reduce the risk of harm and increase the chance of things progressing forward so that the kid will get a good night's sleep and you also will get a good night's sleep, all those kinds of things. Anyway, so The Ferber method involves you, the beginning, before sleep training, typically what you're doing is you're holding the baby often, and they fall asleep in your arms. Maybe you just leave them there, or you just kind of roll over and put them on the couch and keep an eye on them or something, or you pick them up, take them in another room, put them in your bed or the crib or something, or something else, and then you just kind of hope that they stay asleep. Maybe they wake up for a couple seconds, but then they kind of, fall asleep again. And they wake up soon afterwards, and then you're back to that process of, maybe feeding or changing or loving or eye contact or little games that you play with them, peekaboo, whatever. And, the cycle goes on. Well, when it comes to the Ferber method, that process of, it's 3 a.m. and the crying wakes you up, and you're like, oh, okay, it's your turn. And then your partner goes, okay. And then you're supposed to follow this schedule of, okay, well, this week we are on the 5 minutes method, or the 5 minutes phase, where, okay, we go into the crib, maybe the child is right there in bed with you, or in a crib next to the bed, pick up the child, and you time it for, 5 minutes. Again, depending on what's happening with the kid, because sometimes the infant will wake up in a state of deep distress, and probably that holding should be extended until you are assured that the child is no longer in distress. Sometimes kids will wake up and just kind of start to make a little noise, and you're like, okay, I better jump on that before they, get riled up. Anyway, so but the general idea is that in the beginning, you go to the infant, you pick up the child, and you wait a fairly long time, because the expectation is that the child is going to need that. And age appropriateness, right, which has its whole science to and approach, which I'll get to in a second, that you would reduce that time, and you would set an egg timer or set a timer on your phone or something. Again, it should be malleable and flexible to the scenario and to the kid, but that's the general idea. And it can be effective. If it's done well, this is one of the models that could work if the fundamentals are understood and incorporated, which I'll get into. Another method that's similar is the fading method, they'll call it. The parent gradually reduces the amount of time spent on activities that help the baby fall asleep. So it's not just the holding, it's the lullabies and the other kinds of things that tend to help a child fall asleep. So it's similar to the Ferber method. There's also what they call bedtime fading, and this is trying to change the bedtimes of the infant so that it's mainly at night, right? Because that's not often the case in the beginning. So when I think most parents do some version of this, and this isn't exactly sleep. It's a part of sleep training, but it's different from, the helping the child be comfortable sleeping on their own. This is more about trying to get them on a schedule. So, and physicians will talk about this with the parents, like when the child is in the middle of the day and they've already had a couple naps, you see them start, their rhythms, and that if you put them down or you hold them or you feed them, they're going to fall asleep. And so you try not to do that because you're trying to get their circadian rhythm. Anyway, so that's a little bit different from sleep training as opposed to just sleep timing training. Anyway, and so this is fading in that you gradually do that, which can be done in a non-damaging way if it's responsive to the child. Another method that has been proposed, I'm guessing there was a charismatic author that proposed this, is called the chair method. And it involves the parent sitting in a chair next to the crib and slowly moving further away from the crib each night. Again, it's a gradual thing. So you're hearing the themes here, right? Is that there's a gradual nature to some of these methods. Again, if you understand the fundamentals, this will just come out from that understanding. You don't have to follow it, rigidly any of these models necessarily. There's the pick up, put down method. When the child cries, you pick them up to soothe, then you put them back down once they are calm. You wait until they're calm. And this is all with the hope that the child will adjust to sleeping on their own over time. This one, which I'll get into later, can absolutely be effective. But without understanding other fundamentals, this could run awry in that the parent might not ever be moved, the sleep training might not ever progress. So there are certain things to keep in mind. This one, if a parent told me they were doing this, I would sigh with relief a little bit, because this method has the least risk of causing harm if not done. Anyway, and the last method that I'll mention that people sometimes talk about is the no tears method. Proponents essentially of this method believe that children will naturally eventually sleep on their own, and they believe that, generally speaking, other methods that I've been over, particularly the cry it out method, that these methods are draconian and harmful. And this method is more of a philosophy in that any distress is to be avoided, which is actually true, which I'll get into in a second. This is sometimes associated with attachment parenting. There's a whole move. Attachment parenting is related to attachment theory, but it isn't. It's a particular application of it. There's also just general attachment parenting, which is outside of the branding of attachment parenting. Anyway, so the hope is that by helping a child to adjust or to help a kid with their distress, that the kid will eventually actually push to sleep on their own, because they'll grow up and they'll want to do that kind of thing. And that might happen, but that might not happen. It's not assumed. And the pitfall to this could be that you have a 12-year-old sleeping in your bed, which I've treated families like this before. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's a cultural no-no in my neck of the woods. If you have a 12-year-old that sleeps in bed with the parents, you're just like, oh my God, that's disgusting. And I'm just like, where does your head go? What do you think is happening in the bed? You're the sicko for inserting something in there. As individualistic, materialistic, industrial Americans and Seattleites, we have a very particular way of looking at co-sleeping and this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying everything is above board and everything's healthy. I'm just saying that it's not automatically a problem, but it can be annoying. As a parent, especially if you have other kids, if you have 5 kids and one by one they're all kind of rotating into, building up. You have this. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. In the past, in all likelihood, for the majority of our species, that's how we slept. We didn't have homes or bedrooms for thousands and thousands of years, and I'm just going to take a guess and say that mom and dad didn't, walk across the savannah and find a private spot behind a tree so that their kids couldn't bother them. Maybe to have sex, but not to sleep throughout the night. Anyway, so it's complicated is the point, and there's a lot of culture in this. All right, so let's take a break, and when we get back, I'll continue with this presentation. All right, so I want to take a quick break and have you check in with yourself right now, because there's a lot of passion around parenting for good reasons. And I want you to think about how things might be registering to you right now as I'm talking about this. Maybe it's in reaction to something I said, or it's completely unrelated, just the idea of being parented or parenting yourself. The kinds of traumas that can come up are your own childhood traumas related to parenting in general, but maybe even sleep training or sleep. But also as a parent, you might have been through a divorce, and a major catalyst for the conflict was how to approach sleep training or parenting in general, right? So check in with yourself and take care of yourself, because this can, there's a lot of reasons as to why this would produce a lot of passion and distortion and bias, by the way. The other thing to check in on is, as I'm talking, if you are a parent, then you probably are checking in with yourself regarding how did I parent or how am I parenting? And the things that I am presenting to you and I'll get to this later, it kind of has the feeling of like, well, if you follow these fundamentals, everything will be fine. I'm not saying that. And also, there are realities to life that require, I'll just say this from the beginning, that there are realities to life that may require a parenting practice, whether it's related to sleep training or otherwise, that in all likelihood is harming the child. Now, of course, harm to children, we don't want that, but I'm here to tell you, and experts and researchers will say this too, that there's no way to avoid harm. Harm is going to happen. This isn't to say to be complacent or to normalize abuse, and I'm talking about the basic level of harm. Like one harm that, if you've been with young kids, you've seen them go through this, that say they had a cookie and they want another cookie, but that's not in the cards for them today. They've had too many cookies, or you don't have another cookie or something. And you have to break the news to the child that they're not going to get another cookie. And maybe you deliver it in the most empathetic, nice way, and the kid has a meltdown. Well, even though we would say to ourselves, well, I'm doing good parenting right now for a variety of reasons, that doesn't negate the fact that this child, this immature, underdeveloped, confused, over emotional, irrational human being is interpreting this in a very negative way, either because of their mood or they're grumpy or they're running up against this new idea that they can ask for things and they didn't expect that they could get a no, or or they just really want a fucking cookie because who doesn't want a fucking cookie, and they're losing their shit. And they're not being manipulated. They're not drumming it up to sort of manipulate you to give you the cookie. They're genuinely having a meltdown. They are not mostly reacting to the cookie deficit, but they feel like you don't love them, or that you don't care, or that they'll never get another cookie, or they'll never get anything they want, or they have no power in the world, or whatever, or they're a bad kid. Kids will conclude that erroneous, even though you do everything perfectly. In that state, however long it lasts, harm is occurring. They are writing scripts that are not accurate about themselves and other people, that is going to harm their idea of themselves and of their people and relationships and trust. Those things are going to happen, and rarely is it talked about that way. And I'm not saying that you should be staying up at night worrying about these things. What I'm saying is that to avoid harm is a harm in and of itself, because you can't, and you'll beat yourself up, or you'll become overly attentive to a child and deny them the opportunity to grow up. Because these harms often can help a child grow up, to learn how to cope. It's like, every time that happens, like with the cookie, they learn, when my mom says no about a cookie, I have to learn how to regulate myself, and with help with the parent about just general emotional awareness and regulation and mirroring and attunement, which I'll get into in a second. The child slowly but surely eventually is able to ask for a cookie, get a no, and only have a single tear instead of a full meltdown. So it's harmful, but it's also an opportunity for learning. It's hard as a parent, and it's hard for the kid, who said parenting or being a child was easy. So there are times related to this that practical reasons will arise that will result in you as a parent having or doing parenting practices now or in the future that are not optimal regarding sleep training. That you will say, okay, I have a plan, but I'm running up against this thing because my partner is out of town and I'm sick and I don't want to get my child sick. There's just so many different scenarios. Or I'm working 1.5 jobs just to buy formula and I can't, I'm only one person. So there are reasons as to why that. So do not beat yourself up for that. Look at things and try to do the best you can, but you can't avoid some harm. So the problem that will happen is that some parents, when they get to that realization that it's not practical to do everything perfect as a parent, whether it's sleep training or otherwise, they will either go into denial about harm or about parenting, and they'll get defensive. It's like, well, my way is the right way, which can result in a lot of horrible things. Or they'll just pull away, or they'll become overprotective. Some unhelpful reaction will happen for the parent. So this is not taught to us in culture. I don't even necessarily hear parenting experts talk along these lines. Maybe they do. Let me know in the comments if you've heard a parenting expert talk along these lines. But it's very important because so often parents will go to a class on parenting or come to therapy and they walk out with empowerment of knowledge and an approach or something. But when they actually start to do it, they're like, oh my God, so often I'm failing. And I know now, because I've seen the light, that this is not good for my child. Oh no. And the other thing that I tell people, and sometimes this is in the baby shower card that I give, I will say, my hope is that you are a good enough parent enough of the time such that your child only needs therapy for 5 years instead of 25 years. And, a therapist friend of mine appreciated that in a card. Yes, I wouldn't just give it to anybody. But it is a sentiment that I tell people, clients included, with the acknowledgement that you're going to fuck things up not only because of circumstance, but also your personality. No one's perfect, especially if you come from trauma and you've never had good parenting modeled to you. It's a struggle. So it doesn't say to release yourself or to normalize abuse in particular, to normalize deficient parenting. It's just be realistic and approach the reality of it. And if you're seeing other parents, consider this because every parent I know and every client parent I work with feels like they're failing and that everyone else is doing it right and they're doing it wrong. And I mean, to varying degrees, particularly young parents, particularly young new parents. So, that's my rant about that. Okay, so this next section, I want to lay out, in my observation, the 4 different sleep training types or experiences or approaches. And this might help to elucidate the healthy way to approach this. The 4th way or approach or experience is what we're trying to get to, and the first 3 are not. So number 1 is what I'm going to call the overly permissive type of sleep training, in that the caregiver avoids all discomfort. The parent caregiver is terrified of the child being unhappy or the child being uncomfortable or the child having a bad experience. Or sometimes some parents are overly paranoid about their child being kidnapped or something, even though they're home and the doors are locked. There's trauma and things can happen. So, but generally speaking, it's more that the parent, either because of their own traumas or their own life or judgment from the outside or just confusion or something, they are very activated when the child cries or when the child is calling out for them, when you're trying to help them slowly adjust to sleeping on their own and at night. And as a part of this, not always, but often these overly permissive sleep training parents will have an effort to sleep train, but they will be inconsistent. So one night they'll be very hard-nosed about it or healthy about it, and then the next night they just completely give in. So that the child is experiencing this random thing, and what it's teaching the child is that they can learn a lot of really negative lessons. Because sometimes when one of the ways of thinking about sleep training is that there's probably going to be a phase where the child has a question mark about, wait, are my parents really there for me, or do they really love me? I know that sounds horrible, but if you've been around young kids, and they're very black and white, they have a very quick toggle switch to, oh my God, no one loves me, okay? Even pre-verbal kids. So, and this is a funny way to talk about it, but one way of talking about sleep training, particularly with kids that aren't super easy, that there's going to be a phase like that. You want that phase to be as short as possible and as least amount of intensity as possible, right? But you're like, well, that's likely to happen. Well, if you do it right and you're flexible and adjust to the kid, then that question mark will be minimal and it will be brief. Maybe it happens for a few days or something, or it's barely asked by the child over the span of a month or something like that. Whereas if you're inconsistent, then there's a chance that the kid will periodically be asking themselves this question: why are my parents not coming to me when I'm crying? Oh, it must be because I'm a horrible person or I can't trust other people. And it extends that question. It extends it, right? So that's important to understand. Infants don't know how the world works. They have limited experience with humans. They don't know what we do, and what we do teaches them a lot of lessons, whether or not we are trying to teach them that or not. And there's a lot of ways to cause these kinds of harms. Inconsistency is one of them. Now, I'll say that for you parents out there that might have given in now and then, it's not the end of the world. In fact, it's always going to happen. So being inconsistent a couple times while you're going down the road is normal. It's not ideal, but like I said, there's, for the rest of your parenting life with this child, you're going to occasionally miss the mark and not do the perfect thing. All right, so some of the outcomes that are predicted with this kind of overly permissive. So there are versions of being overly permissive in which you're not inconsistent, in which you just don't push things at all. Now, I want to differentiate the overly permissive anxious parent from the overly permissive non-anxious parent. So non-anxiety will result in more differentiation and more level-headedness that will likely result in eventually getting down the road. The parent isn't running away from an unknown danger, right? The parent might be, there's parents that I've worked with who are more into the attachment parenting side, or they're just super mellow about the whole thing, or they were raised in a particular way, or they're trying to counteract the way they were raised or something, and they would allow the child to sleep in the bed with the parents a lot longer than what would be typical to the culture, which is important to think about, meaning that it provides bias, right? But also longer than what's really necessary, or maybe even what would be helpful for the kid to go down the road of independence. But because the parent isn't running away from an unknown danger of some sort of trauma or anxiety or overblown overprotectiveness, that things will adjust in the family because the kid will want to sleep on their own, or the parents will one night say like, oh, it'd kind of be nice. And they don't have that barrier that they run into. For the overprotective anxious parent, even if they have the impulse to change things and to start moving down the road of sleep training or any parenting kind of thing along those lines, they will bump up against that anxiety, and then the anxiety will affect them, and they'll start to brainwash themselves into believing that this is the right way to be overprotective. So I just want to differentiate. But for overpermissive, anxious parent, inconsistent, potentially parent, the child in all likelihood will remain dependent, not because they're being spoiled. Spoiling a child, if everything else is going well and you just spoil a child, they might have some normalcy to their entitlement, but they'll get all their other needs met, and they'll want to sleep on their own eventually. They'll want to be independent. This notion of you can't spoil a child is a harmful notion, which I don't know if I'll go into more. But what the child will develop overdependency from is that they don't believe that they're safe. And they believe that they have to signal constantly to their parents that they're in danger and that they need you, because sometimes you're there, sometimes you're not, And they've never experimented with doing things on their own, so they just assume that they're terrible at it. Plus, they're getting all these messages from their parents that they're incompetent and they're constantly in danger. You know what I mean? So dependency comes from that. Another outcome is that the child might have difficulty developing independence in general, right? Not only sleep training, but in general. Also, the parents will be overworked and will not have their own lives, right? To some extent. Okay, so that's number one, is the overly permissive, anxious parent. The other style that is generally not recommended is being overly harsh. So this is people that are hard-nosed about the cried-out method, for example. And essentially the premise, and you'll see this, and it has to do with spoil the rod, spoil the child, or don't spoil your children, or don't make your infant boy into a mama's boy, or you don't want to have because the messages are out there, particularly in mainstream American society, that, and I've heard parents say this in person and online, they'll be like, yeah, my 9-month-old isn't sleeping in the crib on their own, and I'm worried that this child will never leave the house and not go to college and never get a job. I mean, what am I supposed to do? And it's just like, oh, where did that come from? Or because of the way they were raised in an overly harsh way, or in an overly permissive way, and then the pendulum swings them as a parent. They're too harsh. Anyway, so there's this there's a foundation for why these parents do, either programming or, like I said, history or something. And they'll say things like, you have to teach the child who's boss. And in mainstream American culture, on average, and I think research shows this, but I can definitely say anecdotally, on average, and this is changing, but on average, mainstream American parents believe that each phase of independence should occur years before they actually should occur. And sleep training included. Anyway, so this notion of just from the very beginning, the parents have to establish, I'm the boss, and when I tell you to sleep through the night, you're going to do that, and I'm not going to be manipulated, and you have to learn you can't push me around, or they future trip and say, if I don't draw the line here, then the kid's going to be demanding cookies and cars and diamond rings, and I can't have that shit, so they need to, it's just like, whoa. It's a 12-month-old child, calm the fuck down. Plus, anyway, so there's that. Also, some of these parents will say, you got to have boundaries with kids, and you don't want the kid to manipulate you, that kind of stuff. And, and manipulation is a thing. That'll happen for sure. Maybe we'll get into that, but to assume that's always happening. So the way to think about this is that the child will be in a state of distress, depending on how easy it is. You can do this approach, and if the kid is super easy, then there will be minimal problems from that. That's an important, I just want to point this out. You can be a horrible sleep training parent, and if the kid is just naturally sleeping throughout the night, or doesn't freak out, or doesn't miss you when they wake up in the middle of the night, and they're cool, and they haven't turned off their emotions, that's key, then it could work. And then you can have a parent that writes a book and says, look, I succeeded with this method. It's like, no, it's your kid, not you. Your kid managed in spite of you, honestly. Anyway, so the idea is that what can happen is, you could say as a metaphor for this, is that you're frying the nervous system. The flooding of all the stress hormones is not good for the body and the mind and the soul and the trust and the self-esteem. And it obviously can cause all the problems related to attachment, personality, and development, just cognitive development. Anyway, so the outcome of this is that often the child will indeed stop crying, but it's because they've given up on humanity. So the third type is what I've been alluding to, which I'm just going to call it just happened, in that some kids are super easy. And the sleep training, and for some parents, they were using a method and it just happened to work because the child was just prone to that kind of adjustment. Or the parents, even before they engaged in sleep training formally, the child just adjusted. and it's like, oh, we didn't even have to do any sleep training. That was easy. I'm going to write a book on this and tell everyone that they have to do it like me. So that's the third type. The fourth type is what we're trying to go for, which is attunement. It is flexible. And this is associated in research, because a lot of research in this is associated with good outcomes, meaning that the child has lesser harm and less signs of harm. Literally 20 years later, they'll follow these kids and there'll be those kind of markers. The parents will have less stress. The family will have less stress. Anyway, so this approach is more nuanced, is flexible. Like I said, it has to do with attachment and differentiation yourself. But anyway, so this approach is typified by the parent being responsive to the child's signals and bids and communication, and that the parent is responsive to that most of the time. That's what attunement is two things. Attunement is that you are noticing enough of the time, not all the time because that's humanly impossible, but you're noticing enough of the time what the inner world is like for your child, whether they're just bored and mellow, or they're distressed, or they're angry, or they want a marshmallow, or whatever. Most of the time, because you've been paying attention, and because you don't have enough, or you don't have too many perceptual problems, like in the case of personality disorder or bias or something, that you see the child mostly accurate most of the time. So not only do you notice, but then you also respond well most of the time. And by responding well, that doesn't always include soothing. There's a lot of ways to respond to a child and their experience. Sometimes soothing, obviously, particularly when they're very young, but sometimes it's just letting them work it out themselves, So how do you know what to do? Well, it's complicated. And if there are problems, then a specialist is probably needed, because things can get kind of weird. But anyway, so with this style of parent sleep training, there's structure and intention, but it's not rigid. So there's a plan, and whether that's like with an egg timer, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, okay, or it's just the general goal of like, well, we want to eventually get to this point, and so what are the iterative steps to get there, that sort of thing. Maybe you make up your own graduated progression to the end goal. It's done with intention, meaning that you have thought about it and you're up for it. You have motivation for it. You're not complying with someone else begrudgingly, right? Another parent, or you're not doing it because a book told you. It's like you're doing it because you want to do it, because that's the only way it's going to work. But you're not rigid, because every kid's different. Every situation's different. They could have had too many marshmallows and cookies just before bed, and they're a little weird that one night. So, you got to adjust. So boundaries are established, meaning that there are times when you say, okay, I'm going to now let you cry for a little bit of time or protest, but it's time for you to sleep or whatever. And you draw the boundary, depending on the style and depending on the kid. But there are times when you have to do that, but you do it with warmth. And you also have in mind, I have to be very good at attuning and noticing if I do this and the child completely freaks out and has a total unbridled meltdown, I got to run back in there. But, and any parent worth their weight in salt, is that a saying? I'm terrible with idioms. Let's just say that's what it is, will know the different cries, right? They will say that out of a scale from 1 to 10, that is a 3. Oh, that's a 9. And or that's this kind of crying, right? And so you want to, again, with flexibility and given where you're at in the gradual progression, that if the child is having like a 6 or even a 5, that you don't continue with the boundary, that you do what's in the structure to bring that distress down, okay? Which often involves going to them, holding them, or being with them, that sort of thing. Okay. So, but what it also means is that some distress is baked into the system, right? There's likely going to be a bit of protest. It's similar when you drop kids off for preschool or kindergarten or something. Not every kid. Some kids are dying to go. They're just like, yeah, mom, get away. I want to play with these kids, and I want to go to school, and I'm ready. But a lot of kids, especially in the first day, it's at the very least uncomfortable, if not terrifying. And the same principles apply here, by the way. And in our culture, when it comes to the first day of preschool or kindergarten, it's just assumed that, and I don't know, maybe today with preschools and kindergartens, they're more flexible, but what I would like to see is that everyone involved, the teachers and the school and the parents, approach dropping the kid off in the same way, right? That if the child is having a 3 distress level or even being a little manipulative because they just are a little scared, kids will do that sometimes, that you say, you can do this, you got it, and then you drive away and you're just like, I don't know, but that looked like I'm solidly knowing that was a 3 out of 10 or a 2. But if you see a 7 out of 10, then something else has to be done. Now, sometimes it's not practical. Sometimes, you might have surgery yourself and you're a single parent and you got to drop the kid off at daycare and there is no option because your parents live across the country and, it's just sometimes shit's got to happen and you got to do what but if we can and we have the privilege and the ability, then we want to plan in advance to allow for the possibility, even if your kid's pretty mellow and easygoing, you could drop a kid off at preschool and they could just completely flip out. They could smell something that bothers them or whatever. They might be totally fine spending the night at grandma and grandpa's and watching you drive away, but going to it's different. Anyway, so for them, you want so the system needs to, in my view, allow for the possibility that for some kids they're going to be dropped off and they're fine. For other kids there'll be a little bit of stress, and for other kids there should be this allowance of gradually going down the road where eventually you leave them there. Like maybe the first few days you have the luxury of being there helping them to, or they only are there with you in the car, you're like nearby, or something like that, you get my point. So another part of this approach is that the parent, the caregiver, knows and regulates their own emotions, because it's half of the situation is the parents themselves, right? So know your emotions and have effective ways of regulating that. Not to subdue your own love of your child, like your child's having a meltdown and you're like, I need to regulate this love. No, but your over-anxiety will ruin things in some, or will present a barrier in some direction, either by being overprotective or turning off yourself. I've seen this happen with kids that have particular needs or have particular tendencies. Maybe it's an adopted kid or a kid with pretty severe early ADHD, early version of ADHD. The parents will just be dealing with an onslaught of difficulty day in and just 24/7. And you have to have some way of coping. And one of the ways, unfortunately, when parents aren't given support or know-how or something, for some of these parents, they'll just turn off and they can't love that child anymore because it just hurts too much. In order for them to show up and actually do the gig of parenting, they can't care in the way a parent does, and that's a tragedy, of course, right? So there's a lot of problems when parents don't know and regulate their emotions. A lot of therapy, trauma recovery, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, all right, let's take a break. When we get back, I'm going to talk about the fundamentals that I've been referring to earlier. All right, we're back from the break. So again, check in with yourself. This can be hard, and it can touch on your own traumas as a child. It can touch on traumas of being judged about your parenting. It can touch on traumas about what it was like to raise a difficult child, or raising a child by yourself, or fighting with your spouse, or feeling inadequate, or maybe even you have a 25-year-old kid who is struggling and you wonder if you screwed things up at the beginning or something like this, which is unfair to you. But this is why people freak out when there's conversations about this, because it's naturally going to unearth things. And just check in with yourself and pause and take care of yourself. Also, I'll remind everyone that in parenting, harm is going to occur if we just consider a broad definition of harm, right? Meaning that the child goes through a sufficiently difficult or negative or distressful experience that sets them back regarding their self-esteem and trust in other people, their working model of self and other. What we're going for, though, in reality, is we're trying to go for attunement most of the time, mostly attuned most of the time, meaning that there are times when you're not going to be attuned. Also, in attunement, you're noticing most of the time, you're mostly accurate most of the time, and you're reacting well within reason most of the time. But by definition, there's going to be times when you're not going to notice, or you're not going to notice accurately, or you're not going to react well, or you're going to have your own defense or your own bad mood, and you're going to turn away. And there's going to be a small amount of harm, meaning that there'll be this question mark that is kind of answered by the child. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe my parents aren't trustworthy or something. But when you take the entirety of development and childhood and interactions with you into account, the child emerges into the next phase of development with the notion that they're mostly good most of the time and that their parents are mostly good most of the time. With an understanding that sometimes I'm maybe a bit of a fool and maybe my parents aren't necessarily always there for me. That's okay. It's the way that it is. So if you're judging yourself, I followed that advice, or I followed that cultural protocol of cry it out, or just, dropping the kid off at school and everyone was telling me you just got to walk away. And the kid never really adjusted. And I think I even seen my 25-year-old today that there's some residual. It's normal. And there's always a way forward of healing. There's always a way forward of repair. And all of us have these kind of issues. all of us have experienced. So let me put it this way. The vast, vast majority of us, if not all of us, have experienced high levels of distress upon waking up and our caregiver isn't there and doesn't come fast enough. All of us have been through that, whether it's at 9 months or at 4. I remember some of the worst experiences of my childhood. There's this one that I remember vividly. I would have been 2 years old. Yes, I have memories from back then. That, I'm a napper, and kids are nappers. And I fell asleep in the car seat. And by the way, the car seat that we had in 1973 was metal. It was not a safety car seat. It was basically just a way to stop the child from squirming around. And I'm pretty sure if an accident occurred, like the metal bars that it was made out of would be more of a danger to the child than otherwise. But anyway, so I'm in the car seat and I, fall asleep, and my family, 2 older siblings and my mom and my dad, pull into the parking spot at our house in Sammamish, Washington, and they don't want to wake me up because I'm all sound asleep and I'm in La La Land, and they don't want to disturb me. So they all get out of the car and they go inside the house. I wake up, and I remember even thinking this at the time, afterwards, that when I wake up, I must be in a particular bad mood because I just completely lost it. I had a complete meltdown. I was like bawling and crying and yelling and screaming. And I think my mom even remembers this event and said that once, I don't know, she probably came out and got me, right? And because it was pretty close to the house, our parking spot. And I think my mom said that I was resentful for a while. And, it was so distressful to me. I think mostly because when I woke up, I was in a particular mood. And because I remember thinking this, maybe even in the moment. Again, memories are malleable, but from my memory of remembering it, I remember remembering that I knew I was okay, but I just felt like an injustice had occurred, I was ditched behind. But then another part of me in the moment even knew, no, they just let you sleep. They're in the house. You can see them in the window. But it was this visceral feeling. Okay, so that's in the context of parents that never harmed me, abuse-wise, are still married to this day after almost 62 years. Very stable people. I've talked about in other episodes that anger wasn't a problem. I heard my parents swear once each before I was 25 years old. My mom said, "That damn dog," and my dad said, "What the hell?" Because the dog had puked on all the cushions we were all coming in to the house. Anyway, so now, are my parents perfect? No, because no parent is. But so check in with yourself. Anyway, so fundamentals. Number one, every child is different. I've already been over this. I don't have to say more of that. It's obvious, but it's often ignored. Having said all that, sleep training can start around 4 to 6 months, depending. Doesn't have to if you don't want to. You can start sleep training years later if you. It doesn't. It's just there's no healthy point to do it. But if there is an unhealthy point, which is to try to sleep train like a 2-month-old infant. The brain hasn't developed enough to adjust or to regulate or to learn or something. So, I might even say more like 6 months, but 4 months people will say. Anyway, so that's number one. Every child's different, but there are certain things that you can say that are common, like the earliest phase. Now, not all kids. Anyway, number two, I've already been over this. Attunement. This is critical in all aspects of parenting and sleep training included. So this is noticing their state and then reacting well to their state. And this has to do with secure attachment and all that stuff. And if you concentrate, and when I talk to parents that are freaking out and wanting me to help them, I will hammer on this idea because so many parents will get in their head, especially with all the TikTok videos and everything, that there's like this formula or there's this prescription of how to parent your child. And what I try to really help them do is to discard, maybe that's good advice, but at the fundamental level, what parents have been likely using as a guide since the beginning of our species and before is love, attunement, care, empathy, those kinds of things. And from that occurs. Now, some people say, well, if you're attuned and you have empathy and you care, you'll never push a child to the next phase. That's not true. When you really love a child, when you really have attunement and care and empathy, you actually also want them, for their own sake, to learn how to be competent and learn how to do things on their own. And depending on where you're at in your life, that if you don't get a good night's sleep or you don't have alone time with your partner or something, then you're going to suffer as a person and as a parent, and you're not going to be fully available to your child. You might even start resenting the child. So it's out of love that we draw boundaries with children. That's very important. Loving a child involves both being there for them unconditionally and pushing them out of the nest bit by bit. No, don't just push them out of the nest, but metaphor. Anyway, number three, this is the main fundamental of sleep training, and really any parenting, but sleep training or dropping a kid off at any adjustment period, is lower distress, lower distress, lower distress. I've already been talking about this. You're not likely able to eliminate distress, but you want to lower it. Some distress might even be necessary to some extent, part of the process. But it's definitely not no pain, no gain. Like if a child or if you are effective in your sleep training or a child super mellow and that adjustment is made and there's no distress, that's that's fantastic. You rolled the dice and came up lucky. That's not a phrase, but you know what I'm saying. So you drew the royal flush of poker cards, poker hands. So yeah, but for all the other kids, the key is to lower the stress, particularly beyond a certain threshold. So with some kids, the boundary making or the progression down the road towards them sleeping throughout the night in their crib, whether that's next to your bed or in their own room or whatever, the progression of that could be with minimal distress, and it could be spread out over the span of 3 months or something. With another kid, you could do everything perfectly, and they could have occasional spikes because you didn't predict it because they ate the wrong thing at night, or they're just in a bad mood or something, or they had a bad day at preschool or whatever. Because the sleep training can, with some kids, even though you're doing everything perfect, can last for years. There could be setbacks and regression and totally regardless of what you do. So that's just important to understand and allow yourself to have. And if you're having trouble validating yourself, if you have an experience like that, get a specialist to help you. A lot of what I would do with parents had nothing to do with me helping them with their parenting, and had everything to do with repairing the damage that society has done to these parents about their self-esteem and about their self-worth and about their personal perspective about what parenting is and what can be accomplished and all that kind of stuff. So get a specialist to help you have perspective on the situation. Anyway, so along these lines is similar to my trauma recovery. This isn't trauma, but it's similar to trauma recovery in that there's habituation. So there's a little bit of, so let's say that the first week you will wait 30 seconds before you go into the room and hold them. And you gauge, because you're attuned and you know your kid, that the amount of distress is like a 3 out of 10. But eventually, over time, they habituate to that, and then there's a 0 out of 10 in the second week. So then you have to do the next phase, and that next phase, a little bit more distance, creates maybe it creates a 5. And we're going too fast. We got to have that measure. You know what I mean? Okay, that's a 3. Extend that over time. Another week goes by, goes to 0. If everything's going well, then we do another little step away. The chair method, moving away, that kind of thing. Anyway, number 4, another fundamental is understand that your child wants to slowly move away from you and towards independence. Not completely, but they want to. Not at 4 months or 6 months, but in the long arc of childhood, that's where they're headed, and they want to do that. They don't have to be pushed out of the nest, is maybe one way to put it. So understand that although it might be distressful, like dropping a kid off at preschool, they might only be expressing their discomfort and their fear, but there's another part of them that is desperate to succeed on their own, to experience a new thing, to play with the other kid. Understand that even if you don't see it. Now, don't assume that it's carrying the day and just push them off the edge. But I feel like some parents, particularly codependent, overfunctioning parents, overprotective parents, don't believe that fundamentally their kid actually wants to move away from them and be independent. And some kids, if they're totally overprotective, will question that motive for themselves and will actually actively try to get rid of it. So they might not even be able to express it. So, number 5 is, through a fundamental of sleep training, is value your well-being. Now, some parents don't need to be told this, but many parents do. It's a part of the equation. It's not the only thing, but it's important. Not only just because you matter, particularly for women, mothers, they have been taught their whole life that not only are they nothing in the face of men in the world, but particularly when it comes to parenting, you're required to just completely sacrifice everything about you for the betterment of your own children. No, you're not. That's not okay to you. It's also not okay to your kid. You're not going to be an effective, good parent, not only as a model of how to behave, but also you're not going to have the capacity to be there for your kid. You're going to resent or something. So value your well-being, and that includes if you're married, valuing your marriage. If you have a sex life, then you value your sex life. You value your creative time. Now, in the first number of months or years of a young child, you're going to have to tone that back a little bit because, in all likelihood, you're not going to have the luxury of pursuing hobbies the way you used to. But overall, you matter. Your independence, your well-being, your happiness matters. And if that means that when you do the whole calculus of the whole approach to sleep training, if that means that a little bit of extra distress happens to your child because you're moving a little faster than they want you to, and you're going to get the ability to, get something back in your life, then that can be a fair trade, and that people don't necessarily talk about. Or if people do talk in the way that I'm talking right now in this particular moment, they often are the cry it out people or the draconian parenting people, right? So those charismatic gurus will often talk along with, or super religious. I did this whole deep dive on the Duggars and that kind of thing. There was a book, and a charismatic leader who influenced all those, the IBLPs and the evangelical Christians, about how not to spoil your child. Anyway, and there was literal prescribed beatings of children. And the reason why these gurus appeal to people is because parenting experts and therapists often don't talk about what I just talked about, but it feels like it should be talked about. There's a need there. And so that's what opens the door to manipulative, brainwashing gurus that go too far with it. So experts, we need to start talking about those elements, because if we don't, one, we're not being fair to our people, but also it drives audiences toward, these, because they are speaking something that no one is speaking. Anyway, again, check in with yourself and all the issues, your own trauma, your parenting shame that you've been through. To some extent, shame about parenting, which is unfair to parents most of the time, meaning that I'm going to, but my point is that that a lot of parents, if not most, are hating themselves about their parenting, and my parents included. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with my parents and realized and tried to counteract how much of a failure that they feel as parents. It has to do with the way they were raised. And if there's one thing that my parents should be proud of and feel mostly good about, is their parenting. And they both, I've had long conversations with them about it, that when they dig down deep, they just can't do that. And it has to do with the way they were raised. Anyway, but that doesn't stop all of us kids from showering them with evidence. And I've even, told my parents individually and as a couple, I am a professional parenting evaluator, and I evaluate your parenting as superior. You had your mistakes, we could talk about them, but on average, way above the threshold, at least for me. And so consider if there's an award, maybe I should like a diploma. Anyway, so value your well-being. Number 6 is increase your differentiation, your awareness of your emotions, your ability to regulate. Number 7 is agree on a plan, not only among parents if there are two parents, but also grandparents if there are babysitters or daycare. Like, everyone is on the same page. Number 8, because of the inconsistency. Number 8 is don't judge yourself if things don't go well. If it takes longer or you drop the ball a few times, just get back on the wagon and keep going. Number 9 is don't watch TikTok videos about sleep training. Now, I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but whenever I go on TikTok, which isn't often, but sometimes, particularly when it comes to psychology, ADHD, autism, parenting, mental health, there's some good information out there for sure. I mean, TikTok is it's a giant platform with billions of videos, but there's some horrific thing, in terms of what's going to come up for you on the For You feed. One, it's designed to provoke you. Two, the people that tend to get more likes and upvotes are people that have a snappy, controversial way of saying things, which doesn't lend itself. Think about what I'm giving you an introduction to sleep training in this episode, and notice how wordy I have to be in terms of trying to appeal to literally every parent on the planet. I don't have that grandiosity, but I am speaking generally about parenting, which covers a lot of bases, right? So when you're a TikToker, you're trying to be quick and snappy, and that's why I have X amount of views and X amount of downloads, and the TikTokers have literally millions upon millions of followers. And anyway, because that's just how things work. Anyway, okay. So that is my talk on sleep training. Let me know what you think. And if you want to argue with me, it's totally fine. And if you have your own experience, love to hear it. If you have your own questions, love to hear it. I did not get into really anything specific or anomalous. One that just popped in my head is you can do everything fairly well and get to a certain point where for a year the sleep training has worked. You're done doing the things, and then there's a slide back and a regression or a new kind of experience that the child's going through. The brain is developing quickly, and sometimes there are phases, or the kid goes through something, and things happen. So setbacks are understood. I haven't even got into like wetting the bed or them believing that there are monsters in the closet. There's just a lot of things. So I want to be clear that, and those are just the things off the top of my head. When I worked with clients on parenting, the approach that I had was, I tailored it to every parent, but we might talk for years. There were some clients where parenting was the main thing we talked about, and I talked, and they were in therapy for 5 years, and because every phase of life is a different thing, and kids have their own personalities, and it starts to shine, even at the age of 12 months or earlier, meaning that the child is not just a sponge of everything that's happening around them. They come to the table with something, and that can go a lot of different ways. And sometimes it doesn't interact well with your ways, or in spite of your good parenting, it goes off, or there's an influence from the outside, like, gangs or drugs at school, or, there's just a lot of things to get into as a parent. And it's complicated and it's hard. And so the approach that I had with parents was trial and error. There were fundamentals, which I've been over, and these fundamentals apply to a lot of aspects of parenting. But what I would tell parents is I cannot know what is going to work and what's not going to work. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the fundamentals briefly, because I wouldn't have time to go into all of this in the first session or something. And we're going to collaboratively brainstorm things or a thing that you can do this next week to see if it works. But the key is that if it doesn't work in a week, that doesn't mean it's not going to work because of one reason or another. Either you've been inconsistent up until this point and the kid just knows it's going to go away, so they keep pushing back, or it just takes longer for it to set in or something. So sometimes we have to be very careful about instituting a new practice as a parent, so that we don't set up that cycle where we try something, it doesn't work, and we switch game plans, and the kid's getting this very inconsistent picture. So, we try to really be careful and intentional and thoughtful about, okay, it's sort of like, sometimes with parents, it was sort of like with an antibiotic where you are given a 10-day regimen or a 7-day regimen of an antibiotic, and within 24 hours you're fine. The infection is gone. But in order to not create superbugs and other kinds of problems, you're instructed by your physician to take the antibiotic, all the way through. And similarly with parenting, if the boundary making with a child is kind of like the antibiotic, even though you're 90% sure that this parenting boundary is actually not working, you might actually have to carry it through, not because it's not working, but because you don't want to give the impression that you're randomly changing things up for the child, because you want the child to learn that when you come to the table with something that it's going to be stuck with. And so that lesson might be more important than wasting your time with you know what I mean? Anyway, I hope that analogy made sense, but yeah. So another thing I'll say is I'm guessing that there are some people out there, I don't know if it's you, but there are some people out there that have some pretty weird points of view about parenting and also sleep training, and are almost like religious followers of particular gurus or particular types. And by the sheer fact that I didn't fall into that, I'm guessing some people are going to, I've experienced that before as a podcaster and as a therapist. And I'm not looking forward to that, because those people are completely irrational. It's like arguing with someone who is just generally anti-vax, which is a whole other parent. Anyway, across the board, regardless of vaccination, regardless of circumstance. Anyway, so I'm suddenly worried about that. And if you are one of those people, just use your social skills. If you want to communicate with me, or if you have to communicate with me, or you have a question, then I welcome it. But use your social skills and read the room, and and understand that if you disagree with me, I'm not walking into your home telling you what to do. You can disagree with everything I said and continue to do your thing, and it is of no consequence to you. So, I hope that makes sense. Anyway, new merch, by the way. I don't know if Stacy has made this available, but I like it. Okay, so I actually have a couple emails that fit nicely into this topic, but before we go to those, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So annual patron Patty from Peru, there's a lot of P's in there. Annual patron Patty from Peru, she wrote in and says, "Hi, Dr. Kirk. I am feeling guilty about leaving my 1-year-old baby to go on a 4-day trip with my husband. I'm feeling guilty about leaving my 1-year-old baby to go on a 4-day trip with my husband. I'm scared that she will feel abandoned. When is the right age to leave a baby for some days? And when is the right age to leave the baby for a 2-week work trip? I have one planned. I have a 2-week work trip planned for when she is 16 months, and I don't know if I should go. Thanks. End of email." She wrote end of email. Well, again, it depends on the kid. It also really depends on who else this child is connected to. If the child is connected to your parents, then you could experiment on an overnight thing to see if your child has relatively low distress or no distress, or if there's something that you can do to help with that. It's hard to know what to do with a 1-year-old, though. And and I'll return to something I said earlier, which is that even though some things can cause harm to children, or there's a risk of it anyway, your well-being is important. So for all the reasons that I said earlier. So consider that as well. But I will say, in general, 4 days, you're going with your husband. I'm not telling you not to go, and I'm not saying it's going to harm your kid, and certainly no one should be judging you. It's your choice. And if, overall you're a good enough parent most of the time, then whatever sort of difficulty the child goes through could be adjusted for and essentially erased by all the other good parenting that she goes through for both instances, both for the 4 days and then 2 weeks. Because it sounds like for the 2 weeks, it would just be you leaving town, which would help, right? Because she would be with her father. I assume that's what's happening here. But generally speaking, age development appropriate, so to speak, or the kinds of things that we can expect from a young child, a year old, 16 months, it's asking a lot for a child to regulate and to adjust. Like I said, take care of yourself and do what you, and maybe there's a way around it. I don't know. What I would like to see is what is the goal. So you're going to go on this 4-day trip with your husband. It sounds to me like you and your husband need a break from parenting, which is normal, and or you want to bond as a couple and you haven't been able to do that for a while or something like that. Or you just want to have some fun or whatever. Well, that can be accomplished without a 4-day consecutive trip, right? You can eke out that kind of thing. Maybe, I don't know, if your parents are involved in parenting as well, that you go on a trip with your parents and your kid. And you take these little excursions while you are monitoring, on cell phone. Your parents say, yep, she's doing okay. She's fine. She's just hanging out. And then you know that you're free to continue doing your excursion that day, but you come back home. Because when it comes to these because if you don't have any experience with your baby being away from you for longer than a few hours or longer than a day, you don't know the amount of distress that the child would be going through, and therefore it wouldn't be recommended, I would say. Again, take care of yourself, and how does the kid manage in other scenarios? But 12 months old, that's asking a lot for a child. Another scenario that could help is instead of leaving town, you find other ways to meet those needs for your marriage, for your fun, for your vacation time away from kids that doesn't involve, like I said, long strings of days in which you're not with your kid. Now, if your kid is older, I don't want to put an age on it, but, older kid, there is more likelihood, especially if you've been there most of the time, for the kid's attachment needs, that later on they will be able to adjust much more easily, right? So it's not forever. In conclusion, what I'll say is that it really depends, annual patron Patty from Peru, what the preparation has been prior to you leaving town. If your 1-year-old daughter is bonded enough with her parents or even a daycare. My mom had a in-home daycare and would, I think, fairly frequently, if not all the time, she focused on preschool age kids. So most of her daycare, and again, they were, just running around my house in the living room, in the kitchen, in the playroom, and sometimes sleeping in my bed. I'd come home from school as a teen, and I couldn't go into my room because there'd be some kid taking a nap, which didn't happen very often. Sometimes when listeners hear about that, they're like, "Oh, that was abusive," or that, I don't like that your parents did that to me. I had it all. I was spoiled to some extent. So, a little taking one for the team every now and then is understandable. And I wasn't I didn't need to go to my, it wasn't like I was struggling with being bullied at school or something and needed to recharge in my bedroom. It was just, anyway. So my mom would have an infant occasionally, and I'm pretty sure by regulation, by law, she wasn't supposed to have more than one. There were limitations on how many kids you can have, and there were specific limitations to how many infants, how many babies you could have. I'm pretty sure it was just one at a time. And I would observe, looking back, that my mom was an attachment figure for these infants. The babysitting or the daycare could have occurred before the child really zeroed in on who are those important people. There's the time between 4 to 8 months, that children will start to differentiate between who are their people and who are strangers, and there's pretty hard lines. Sometimes the parent who works more will become a stranger, in essence, to the child. And for these children, they would identify their parents and also my mom. So to be left with my mom was not distressful to them. So for you, annual patron Patty from Peru, hopefully, because of your own sanity, you have other people that have taken care of your child and are able to predict that there's a greater likelihood that the child will have minimal or no distress upon being left with that caregiver for 4 days. So that's just another important thing to think about. All right, and this last email related to this talk today is from annual long-term patron Alex from Ontario. She says, "What can I do to avoid creating an attachment injury for my 2-year-old who loves her mama, me, and is struggling to adjust to daycare?" So apropos of what I was saying. So how do I not cause an attachment injury for my 2-year-old who is struggling with adjusting to daycare? "When I drop her off, she screams and gives me a terrified look like she's being abandoned. She doesn't eat or sleep, and she cries all day. I would like to continue sending her with the hopes she slowly learns it is a safe place and mama always comes back to her, but I am concerned about breaking her spirit and having her settle only because she has given up and not because she enjoys it and feels comfortable. By the way, I'm a new therapist who works from home, seeing clients virtually. In my practice, relational attachment and early childhood problems often come up, and sometimes I worry that while trying to help others heal, I am creating problems for my own child, and I could do more in the world by not working and staying home with her." End of email. Yeah, and that is a viable algorithm to calculate. Your mission, as most therapists have this mission of trying to make the world a better place, and it's possible that in your effort to make a world a better place to some extent as a therapist, you are causing more harm in your own child, in your own home, It doesn't sound like that, by the way, but it is something I suppose to think about in terms of optimizing this scenario. I guess I can just relate to the question that you have. And so you're asking, okay, so let's look at the data. I don't know how many days we're talking about here, because if we're talking about a couple days where your 2-year-old is not eating or sleeping all day and is crying all day and not adjusting at all, and it sounds extreme, which isn't ideal. But if it's relatively short, then, well, again, as you say, that it, if it resolves itself or the child eventually, quote unquote, adjusts, there would be no way to know if the child was giving up or not. So, I've already been over this, but just to reiterate that with all of these attempts to help the child grow up in one of these ways, whether it's sleep training or sleeping throughout the night or going to daycare or going to preschool or whatever, the principles, the fundamentals. So let's just go to our fundamentals again. We want to recognize that every child is different. And as a part of this, you might look at yourself and say, well, the other kids seem to be adjusting fine. What's wrong with my kid, or what's wrong with me? You could have a kid who is not sensitive in any other arena except for this, because kids are weird. Just accept that. Number 2 is attunement. So not only from you, but from the daycare people, right? And daycare people absolutely provide that. That's an important function of daycare, is that they provide attachment security. Attachment security doesn't end when they walk out the door of your house or when you drop them off. Attachment security is across the board everywhere. So ideally, they have eventually, within a reasonably quick amount of time, they have a secure attachment with their daycare people or their nanny or something like this. And that if that is the plan, that you don't, that you have an eye on that, so that when eventually, because those relationships almost always end, right? Whether it's a nanny or daycare, and that you're mindful of reducing the amount of damage, and also like let's say that you are about to, you're moving in 6 months, and you get a new nanny, and there's a very close relationship developing between the nanny and your child, and you know that in 6 months that relationship's going to end. It's just the way it's going to be. Well, work that into potentially your planning. Sometimes that has to happen, but work that into your planning of maybe fostering, maybe nannies aren't the best answer right now, because nannies tend to be very close to, in-home caregivers tend to develop very close relationships, right? So, again, there's sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good, but it's just something to think about. But anyway, so we're trying to lower distress. Now, from your description, you're saying that all day, and I don't know how many days, she's crying all day and she doesn't eat or sleep all day. Now, some parents or people might think this is an exaggeration. There's a good chance this is not an exaggeration. I have seen kids cry in this scenario, or even at the age of 8 at school. They will yell and scream for hours on end. And as a therapist, I will get called in situations like that. So I don't doubt your description here, literally crying all day long, not eating even their favorite food, right? Not going down to nap, obviously, because they're upset. Now, there's a possibility that she's not actually in very much distress, but she's amplifying it because she just is being stubborn. That happens. That's what I'm calling the manipulative side of things. It's not the way to see this, by the way. When in doubt, assume that it's real. But I just want to throw that out there, that it's a possibility. Certainly, some parents have a self-interest to see it that way so they can release themselves of the bother and also the shame or something. But that does happen. Kids can and if you pay attention to kids enough, particularly when kids start to become 2 years old and beyond, you can get a sense of like, oh, that's drummed up, or that's fake. Now, it's important to recognize that even for a child to fake being upset as a way of trying to get what they want, they can actually do it so effectively that they actually become distressed. So it will either it'll look very real, and or it can actually be harmful to them. So, some accommodation or awareness of that doesn't necessarily mean that you accommodate, but, consider that. So if I had based on this description, if I had it my way, which whatever, is that this would have been one of those scenarios that I talked about a while back, where there would be a graduated experience, that the child would be, whatever steps are able to be put in between the dropping off of the kid, especially when you notice pretty quickly that she's having an extreme reaction. And the iterative phases could be, again, it could be short. You could be in the room with her for the first 15 minutes or hour or something, or you could be in your car, or you could go inside with her, and she's not happy, but she's not losing it, and she's glomming onto you, and she's not participating, but she's adjusting to the space and the lighting and the kids and the noise and the smells and all that stuff. And then eventually, either an hour later or maybe the next day, you're able to say, okay, I want you to sit here. I'm just going to be in the other room. Okay. And then the next day it's like, I'm going to be just outside in a chair. And the other day, I'm going to be in my car. This is, potentially more likely to help the child to actually adjust instead of giving up, and or would help the kid to experience a lot less distress. Now, again, I want to say that even if it is the way that it sounds, and you drop the kid off because there wasn't a choice that you had, or you thought it was best, and let's say the child went through like 10 days of this. If you are doing everything relatively well most of the time, aside from that, then in the grand scheme of things, it probably isn't going to do anything. This might be, 4 months of therapy when they're 35 years old. I don't know. But it's not the end of the world is the thing. Having said that, a parenting approach that incorporates this flexibility and responsiveness tends to produce kids with fewer issues and adjusting faster. Because, one of the things about this, action of trying to help them adjust to preschool is that it informs all other future actions like this. When you drop them off for, daycare, you drop them off for kindergarten, or they're going off to college. Like every time this happens, there's another opportunity. So maybe the next time you have a threshold like this that you're crossing, you can incorporate more flexibility around it so that it basically makes up for any kind of problem that existed the first time. Again, I would say the average kid or a lot of kids who are raised well and have secure attachment have had that experience where they're dropped off and they're in a lot of distress and they cry all day long. It's very normal, and most of those kids grow up to not hate their parents. So it just depends. But yeah, so that's what I'll say about that. Again, if I'm guessing annual long-term patron Alex from Ontario, I'm guessing, I hope that you can evaluate yourself and validate yourself, generally speaking, as a parent, and could say, I am doing a damn good job overall. That one thing kind of had to be done that way. Not great, but I am fulfilling so many needs around the clock. That wasn't ideal, but on the grand scheme of things, that's like 0.0001% of the big picture. The key, and I will, whenever I talk with parents, I'd always return to this, sometimes at the end of the session, to just sort of reset and remind them, so you can remind yourself, if you're a parent, that you are doing a lot to attune, to notice, to care, to love, to reduce distress, to pay attention, to protect them. And all of those moments, we tend in our culture anyway to see parenting as just only coming into focus when something bad happens. But all the times, think yesterday as a parent, maybe in that day, nothing bad happened or nothing significantly bad happened. Well, every second of that day where nothing bad happened and you were mostly attuned most of the time and responded mostly well most of the time, was neurons being oriented and conclusions being made by the child that they are a good person and lovable and you can be trusted. Every second that goes by reaffirms that, and very good things are happening. So in the grand scheme of things, when there's a bad thing, it's in relation to all of that other stuff. Does that make sense? All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Check in with yourself again and take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.